Of Compressed FM, a podcast all about web development and design with a little bit of zest. In this episode, we're going to talk all about the state of cross platform applications in 2023.
Web development and design, who would have guessed? Well, we can do them both, even add a little zest. So turn up the volume, get ready for the best. Let's get it started in this episode of Compress.
What's up, everyone? My name is James Hugh Quick, and I am a full-time technical content creator. And today I am joined with our amazing guest, Simon Grimm, to talk about the state of cross-platform applications. Simon, welcome to the stream/podcast. Do you want to tell people a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Thanks for having me. Glad to be back. Yeah, I've been on your live stream a couple of weeks ago. It was already great back then. And today talking about probably my most favorite topic I could talk for the whole rest of the evening about. I'm a developer by heart. I started as a native mobile developer after university. And I quickly transitioned into this whole landscape of cross-platform applications then. We can talk a bit about the frameworks and the technologies and all of that later. But fast forward a few years, I decided that, working for a company probably wasn't my thing. So I went out, started a blog, which evolved with a YouTube channel that has now grown to 50,000 subscribers. And it also evolved into the Ionic Academy, which is an online school, a membership site focused completely on the Ionic framework. And today, I'm still running that platform. I'm self-employed since almost 8 years now, I think. And I'm also working on the second big platform, which is called galaxies.dev, which will be another big membership site focused entirely on web and mobile development. So a lot more beyond Ionic, covering things like Next.js, Tori, SvelteKit, bleeding edge, cutting edge, and all of that featuring other content creators. And that's my story. Since I want to put this first, I'm self-employed. Although if I celebrate things like Ionic or other technologies, I'm not really affiliated with them. Although I might do something for Ionic in the future, but I never was in the past. I was never part of any of those companies. So everything that I say about those tools is based on my experience with them and how much I enjoyed them.
Love that. You kind of hinted at maybe you'll do something with them in the future. So a little bit of a tease for people that I think would be cool. I'm kind of curious about the native mobile development that you started with. And I assume native actually can mean different things. Some people only consider Java, Kotlin, and Objective-C and Swift. Only native is only that versus other platforms that we'll talk about more have native they can tap into native features. So native means different things. But what can you tell us a little bit more about what you did starting out when you were doing mobile development?
Yeah, when I got started, I actually started with Objective-C because I wanted to develop an iOS application with a friend in university, which we also did. It wasn't successful or anything, but it was just a great experience. And I don't know if you've been through some degree as well, but pretty much learning programming in university, it's not like they really teach you programming. You have to be curious and just build your own stuff. So we learned Java and testing and how algorithms work and those kind of fancy things. But at the end, you really need to do your own stuff. So we built our own little application. We both learned Objective-C. Back then, I think you could access this Stanford course or something for free online. I think it actually still exists to this day. It was an epic resource already back then. And I've just always been in love with mobile apps. So that's how I got started. Because I don't know why. It just got to me with the first iPhones and having the ability to build something and then have it in my pocket. I found this quite cool. So this somehow, even 10 years later, 15 years later, it's still having a grip on me. I don't know why.
Yeah. Well, I had a similar maybe epiphany of the power of being able to write code when I was in college, because I have a computer science degree and I've talked about this a lot. I didn't learn near the things that I should have learned to the depth that I should have learned them in college for various different reasons. But one of the things that I did do that I think really changed my life as a cliche was I heard about people doing Android apps, and I was like, how do you do that? That's really cool. And so they gave me a book, and I was doing that, and I got bored, and I just decided to like, I know enough. I'll just go build something and kind of Google along the way. And I built a Harry Potter trivia app. That's kind of my claim
Nice.
to fame at the time, and published it to the store. And that was kind of a game changer for me of my mindset as a developer of like, okay, I have these skills. I can actually build something that people use. But also, one of the things that still hits home to me is every time I think about building like a small SaaS product or like a small product of some sort, every time I think about it, I'm like a website is nice, but like you kind of have to have the mobile app associated with it. Like everybody wants to have that mobile app experience to be able to access features and functionality and information
Mhm.
on the go. So if that stuff's not there, you're kind of not like fully representing or fully tailoring towards your audience.
Yeah. I actually don't know a lot of indie creators who are actively working on a website and a native application. Like we got these cross-platform tools, but I also never really heard from them like being very successful. I mean, a lot of companies are using the cross-platform tools, but I just read the other day that indie hackers kind of also favor iOS because iOS revenue is a lot higher than Android. Like you
Yeah.
get more installs on Android, but you actually get a lot more revenue on iOS. So yeah, you're definitely right. That's also how I got into this. I've wanted to build a SaaS with a friend in the past, and we said, yeah, we need a website, but we also need a mobile application. And for those cases, cross-platform is usually the best choice because if you're an army of one or two, like you can't manage a native iOS project, a native Android project, and a web project at the same time. That's just like it's impossible.
Yep.
Instagram can do this, or Meta can do this, and like the big companies. But for smaller dev shops, it's just not possible. It's simply impossible.
Yeah, if you think about the skill sets that it would take. So going from, for example, modern iOS development means Swift, most likely.
Yeah,
And then on the website side, like you just kind of stick with JavaScript. You can layer on things on top of that, but just JavaScript versus Swift, two completely different languages. And
completely.
then two completely different ways of like building user interfaces, two completely kind of everything. Like these are very different ecosystems of tools and languages and frameworks and all the things. And you really like if you're doing it that way, you really have to have teams that are dedicated to each one. Like you have a web development team and you have a mobile app team. And that's where this idea of cross-platform comes into play.
Yeah, and usually even like two mobile teams because Kotlin and Swift,
Android and
it's
yeah.
yeah, Android SDK is completely different than the iOS
Mhm.
SDK, and it's
Yep.
completely than what we can use on the web. So it's completely different things. Like some people have the skills, that's cool, but usually like there's a
It's tough.
tiny to like people being very good at Swift and very good at web development. You won't find a lot of them.
Yep. Yeah, it's just I think both of them take so much effort to get a grasp of and to get comfortable with and to get confident with that it would certainly be a challenge for both. So I'm kind of curious, like what are some of the early tools that you think of that started to try to address this? Like I think Cordova and PhoneGap was one where they were trying to. I mean, I feel like the functionality in that was
Yeah.
like really basic, of trying to again take web technologies and build mobile apps. What are some of the things that you think of that were some of the early tools to try to move towards this cross platform initiative?
Yeah, in fact, I even used one of the earliest tools for my bachelor thesis back then. It was called Titanium Studio, but
Yeah, I remember Titanium.
I
Yeah.
think later it became PhoneGap. There was some kind of
Hmm.
strange branding going on with Adobe
Yep.
and the names. I think that was the first, and then I think Cordova saw the rise for many years, probably until like 3-ish years ago. Like Cordova is still being heavily used, but it's definitely going down. Also, if you look into the surveys, it's definitely declining. I mean, I just happen to have the state of JS open.
Yeah.
So 2016 was Cordova at 58%. Today it's at 22%. So Cordova is definitely declining. The whole idea is still cool. So for those who don't know Cordova, it's basically a way to generate native Android and iOS projects and pretty much display a web view, a complete web view in your application. And in that web view, of course, your web application can render.
Mhm.
So you can write a web application with Angular or React or whatever you prefer. And then with the help of Cordova, you can embed that in a native project that simply displays this. It, of course, doesn't display like the address bar or something. Like it is really a native app that you can also submit to the store and then install in a device. It's like from that perspective, I like to say it is a native app. People like to argue about what's native and what not. You touched this in the beginning. We could probably like have a big discussion about what means native to people. TypeScript also great for can be used. But the cool thing about Cordova is or was that you actually get access to the underlying platforms. So you get access to the Android SDK and the iOS SDK through JavaScript, which was kind of revolutionary back then, because like they're completely different. You usually have to talk to them with Swift or Objective-C or Kotlin or whatever. But Cordova kind of simplified this. So you would have these Cordova plugins, which pretty much have, you can think about it as two separate files. You have an Android file and an iOS file. And in those files, you actually do have a native implementation. You do have Objective-C code or Java code. But Cordova sits above these files and creates a bridge, so JavaScript can talk to these classes. That's pretty much the whole magic that Cordova added. And for many years, that was kind of cool. There are tons of Cordova plugins. I actually don't know the number, but like just search for something, Cordova plugin, and most likely you're going to find a GitHub repository. But there's the but. But that GitHub repository will most likely have the last commit like 4 years ago or 3 years ago, and somebody asked questions. It's not working for my latest version. Will this get an update? And there's just nobody answering because people are kind of stepping back from Cordova. They don't maintain their plugins. All of these plugins are community plugins, and it's very hard to maintain that. So more and more apps are shifting away from Cordova to more modern solutions now.
Yeah, I love I think this is kind of core to moving into cross-platform capabilities. One of the things that people really feel like they miss, again, definition of native changes, but the native features of the device. So accelerometer or GPS or like whatever those features are that are specific to the device. And Cordova having those JavaScript APIs basically was an abstraction layer to then talk to the individual ones. Someone in the chat mentioned working with C#. I did a lot of C# for a while when I worked at Microsoft. And one of the tools that I used was Xamarin, which is still around today. It's a similar concept of they have their abstracted C# SDK that has the ability to talk to the native SDKs for both Android and iOS. And then Xamarin has some UI components and stuff with it to help build UI components. But same general idea. If I want to write this code and have that work for both platforms.
Yeah. I think there's also something more new. What's it called? .NET MAUI? I think this is I don't know if it's even released already, but yeah, Xamarin was also around that time. And yeah, we can discuss what a native app means. So I always make the reference to, like, if my mother or grandmother is installing an application from the iOS App Store to her iPhone and is using that app, to her, that is a native app, like, period. And if you look at this from a user's perspective, any app they can install through the App Store is an app. Like, we developers really like to argue about this and how we format our code, or I don't know which drama, if Tailwind is good or not. Like, we pretty much had everything the last weeks, how you commit stuff or.
Developers are definitely very opinionated. And I think the big concern that people have with their definition of native is around performance. So we mentioned like the idea of the web view thing, which with a native application, with Android and iOS, they each have a web view component where you can just give it a URL and it'll load in a page basically. And that's, I think, primarily what Cordova does. And the thing that people get a little concerned with there is since it's not like tapping into device specific things or loading in the device specific UI framework, they think it's going to be a little slower. And I think this is a bigger concern 10 years ago than it is now, because the devices that people are using are more and more powerful and they're more capable of running a regular web application that's just embedded into that web view.
Yeah, that's exactly the case. So we already had the discussion 10 years ago. I feel like it was deserved back then because
Mhm.
those titanium phone gap apps, they were kind of clunky and shitty to some degree. They didn't feel and look like native iOS or Android applications, but technologies, frameworks, and devices have gotten a lot better over the last 10 years. And in most cases, you basically won't notice a difference. Yes, native is always native, and that native is as close to the SDKs and controls, and you can always bring arguments for when Apple and Android are releasing new SDKs. You're gonna immediately use this. In other cases, you
Mhm.
have something in between. So those are always the arguments for and against cross-platform development. But at the end of the day, cross-platform development works very good for a lot of companies, especially because of the reasons we said in the beginning. You don't have a mobile team. It's simply like you can't hire 5 people if you just on a small budget. It's just not working like that. And you can get great results with cross-platform technologies.
Mhm.
For example, if you have some kind of company internal applications, you also don't really need the perfect UI, and you also don't need to care about if it's like 60 FPS or 55. Your internal, like the employees won't care. If it's a business to customer app, then certainly it should have some sort of specific UI. That's just what people expect these days. But this is usually then the differentiator between the different technologies. We've talked about Cordova. I said this was like a past thing. The evolution of Cordova is kind of Capacitor. So
Hmm.
Capacitor does pretty much the same like Cordova. It was developed by the Ionic company, so we can talk about Ionic in a second. But it's essentially Ionic Capacitor is still doing the same. It's creating those native projects and it's wrapping your web application in that native web view control, and then your app runs on a device. On the other hand, we got someone already here in the live stream chat asked, does anyone have tried Flutter? So Flutter is Google's answer to cross-platform development. Flutter is great and got a lot of attraction because Flutter is really great at marketing. So the Flutter page, the Flutter documentation, everything looks pretty nice. They have specific sections for getting started with Flutter as a React developer, as a web developer, as a Swift developer. So they really want to catch a lot of people. Downside of Flutter is you have to use Dart, Google's own language, which is it's not bad. So I've worked a bit with Flutter, and I kind of like the approach. However, Dart is Dart, and it's not JavaScript, so it's
Yeah, it's tough.
certainly something that might scare off people.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to kind of the original problem of doing cross-platform. You may have needed to have JavaScript and then Swift and then Kotlin, etc. And when you already have that JavaScript experience, I feel like learning a new language like Dart is not necessarily tough. It's not that it's a tough language to learn. I don't know. I've never
Yeah.
used it. It's just an additional transition that you have to go through versus maybe something like Ionic where it's just taking advantage of the JavaScript that you already know.
Yeah, it's definitely something you need to learn. I went through it. Like at some point, if you've been a developer for 10 plus years, you kind of get a feeling for like object oriented
How it
programming
works. Yeah.
languages and how like a class looks and the function. The syntax is always different where you put the brackets or the arrows, but in the end, Dart is okay. And with Flutter, you get a ton of great components out of the box. So you get a great performance with Flutter applications. Everything just works with Flutter, I kind of feel. But at the end, those applications are also in a technical developer sense, not native applications, because Flutter uses something called Skya, which is a rendering engine. So they pretty much paint every pixel on the screen. So it's not like they compile to some
Hmm.
special iOS or Android code. They still paint the whole view themselves. And you can also have Flutter for the web, but then you have your whole app rendered in like a canvas, where Flutter is doing its magical thing with rendering. So Flutter for web is definitely something I would probably not use yet, or maybe for marketing pages. But overall, I kind of like Flutter, the experience. I work with it, and I also try to create a little app with it just to like get some experience with it. Definitely can confirm it's different from web development. But if you're just getting started, probably getting into web technologies is better, as The main choice currently for cross-platform applications is simply React Native. It has been like this for 8 years now. So 2016 React Native was at 92%, and today it's at 74. So it just had like a little natural decline in interest, but that's pretty much normal for every technology that's been around for some years. You see this as well for React or for Vue in the state of JS. But React Native is like what Facebook created for the React developers to make them happy and give them the ability to create native apps.
I love that. Does it work similar to the other tools that we're talking about, where it gives you the abstracted APIs that you can tap into that then talk to both of the native APIs on Android and iOS?
Kind of. React Native is an interesting case. I kind of don't exactly get why React developers jumped so much onto React Native, as I feel like there are better solutions. But at this point, it's just too late. Pretty much the same for React. Like the ecosystem has gotten so big,
so strong.
You like whether you like React or not, it's just dominating the market and probably will for the next years. So with React Native, you can reuse your React skills. So if you're a React developer, you will get into it quite easy. However, it is not the React DOM, like it is not the web development. There are React Native specific controls, like a view, a text, a pressable, a list, and you gotta learn these things, and then also on top add like other frameworks that are available for creating the UIs. So it's kind of like you learn React once. What was their slogan? Learn once, write everywhere. I think something like that. Or learn once, debug everywhere is the cross-platform fun they make of it. But under the hood, yeah, you can once again with React Native access the native technologies. So yeah, definitely React Native is great. It also gives you great performance, great applications. They do render to some degree to native controls, as far as I know, although the JavaScript of React Native application still runs in a different web view. So it is not completely native, but again, who's here to judge what's native and what's not?
Yep. We got a supportive comment from Ferry in the chat on YouTube saying React Native is God. I imagine like it's an easy reaction, right? Like people have been searching for this something to fill this gap. We've had all the different tools and technologies that we've talked about. And with React getting so popular, for then there to be a tool that helps fill that void with leveraging React is kind of a no-brainer in terms of interest. Now, how like details and stuff could vary, but that it sounds like an appealing thing. And it's been on my list of things I'm interested in that I haven't spent time with. Flutter and Ionic are other ones. There's just too many things for me to actually spend time with everything that I would like to. But I definitely get why that initial reaction, it would be very appealing for people that have been writing React for a handful of years.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you would also kind of be shocked and love it how fast you can get from your React web developer skills. That's actually quite interesting. So in the React Native world, there's a tool called Expo. I don't know if you've heard about it, which has become sort of the suite of tools that people use to run and bundle React Native applications. And if you start out a new Expo application and bring up the development server, they will print you a QR code and you can scan it with your device, and it opens like this Expo Go app, and you immediately have your application on a device with all the hot reload and live reload, and you can get started. And Expo is abstracting away pretty much everything related to Xcode, Android Studio, and the native platforms. So you can kind of stick completely in your JavaScript world and write React Native. Okay, the controls and things are a bit different than React Web, but it makes building mobile apps for web developers unbelievable easy, really unbelievable easy.
And that's without us clarifying the difficulty of running, especially years ago. Like I'm sure it's much better because I haven't done this in a while, but trying to test native applications historically has been a mess. And I've run the Android emulators. I've tried to set up iOS simulators. I have deployed to my phone, which at least then was the best. Like if you had a phone, deploy to the phone because it was by far going to be the fastest way to do it. Um, but this, I've heard of Expo and I've heard of that idea of being able to test these things out easier. I feel like I've also heard mixed feedback about how well it works. I don't know if this is true or not. I just feel like I've heard that. Is that something that you've heard like mostly positive experiences with?
Yeah, so I recently asked this question on Twitter, like, is Expo the state of the art that everyone should use? And the result, I don't know why that tweet got massively popular, but
Mm,
it was probably 95% of people saying yes, 100% Expo is the way to go. And that led me to something interesting. So I created a video about this because I can't be the only one who has this question. Because if you open up the React Native docs, you're going to see exactly like the first thing you need to do to learn React Native. You have to pick if you want to use the React Native CLI or if you want to go with Expo. And imagine
mm.
like you're new to React Native and you're sitting there and like,
Yeah, I
okay,
have no idea. Yeah.
what's which right or left? Where's
Mhm.
the air better? So I created a video about this. I think it's not yet live. And I went into all the objections that people put up on YouTube in the past about Expo. So, like from 2, 3, 4 years ago, Ben Awad creating stuff about what he likes and dislikes. And in the beginning, completely agreed. There were limitations with Expo, like there were no in-app purchases. I think you couldn't run ads. Push notifications was challenging, and like
Mm,
using some sort of native modules was very, very challenging.
interesting.
However, in that video and when I did my research, I could counter pretty much every argument because Expo did something about this. Like there are plugins now, tons of plugins available, and they have added something called Expo pre-build, which pretty much generates your local Xcode and Android project, so you can still add like native code if you want to later. So yeah, if you're starting out with React Native right now, from my own research, it looks like you should just use Expo.
Yeah.
You can still use like a pre-build later, and if you're very experienced and know I need these native modules and these specific things, and this stuff is not supported by Expo, then yeah, well, maybe then you can go with React Native CLI, but like 95% just go with Expo.
Covered. Yeah. Yeah. That's often the case. I think with a lot of these things is people kind of zoom in on the things that don't work as well or aren't supported. And the reality is like those aren't the most common things, which is probably
Yeah.
why they're not supported. So unless you find that specific reason not to, then I think also like just give it a chance for yourself individually. Um, we talked React Native. I know what I think like your most experience is with Ionic, and I've gotten to talk to Ionic a few times at the booth, and I always enjoy at conferences. I've always enjoyed hanging out with them and learning a little bit about Ionic, but I don't know a ton. But I have been really interested in it. Do you want to give people like a quick overview of what Ionic is, and maybe if there's any background on like why you chose to try it out or why you ended up liking it so much?
Yeah. So the interesting thing, first of all, is that Ionic, it's like if we say Ionic, it doesn't actually fit into the picture of React Native and Flutter and what we talked about, because Ionic is a lot of different things. And what we usually think of is Ionic UI components, and that's just a set of UI components. But I started with Ionic when it was very early, like version 1 in 8+ years ago. I don't know. That's also when I started blogging about it, and it got some traction. So back then, Ionic was heavily tied to AngularJS, a choice they
Mm.
probably regret, because AngularJS was like, yeah, it wasn't good, and people to this date still hate Angular because AngularJS was around. I don't know why, because
I feel
Angular
like
is
it was
getting so much
actually
better.
yeah, well, it's funny because I was actually gonna say the opposite. I feel like people at the time of transition hated Angular 2 plus because they enjoyed Angular JS, and it was but more
Oh,
importantly, it was such a big transition to the
oh yeah.
next iteration. And that was like I think a lot of people went from Angular JS and then were like, if I'm gonna learn a new framework, I'm gonna learn React because of it gaining popularity. But that's an aside.
Yeah. So back then, also with Ionic, what you had to use was Cordova because there was no
Mm,
capacitor at that point. So it was a combination of Ionic had pretty much like UI components heavily tied to AngularJS, and building your native application was done with Cordova. However, the Ionic company is kind of smart, so they figured out that Cordova wasn't the best way, and I don't know when exactly, like it was 4 or 5 years ago. They developed Capacitor. So Capacitor is also part of the Ionic company, and as I said before, Capacitor is like Cordova 2.0. So don't quote me on that. But it kind of feels like that because it's using Swift instead of Objective C now, which is like the standard for iOS applications, and they made a few choices under the hood that were just different to Cordova. So Cordova, for example, does a lot of magic. When you run a Cordova build, it will generate a native project based on like a config XML file in which you have different settings and stuff. And whenever you do this again, it completely regenerates your native Xcode or Android project studio project. And it can be really horrible if you do like specific settings inside of Xcode or the native platforms that you need to configure. So then you need to plug in hooks, and it just becomes a big magic. And with Capacitor just once generates those native projects, and then you can actually check those projects into source control and apply changes if you want to, like put in whatever change in Xcode and it will be persisted. Capacitor won't magically change that. So that made a lot of things easier. And Capacitor's idea was to have like a unified API. So you can write, I don't know, camera get image. And that API call should work on iOS and Android and also on the web, because the whole Ionic company was always focused on like web standards and making everything work on the web. And, especially also like making it work in progressive web applications. So that was always the focus of Capacitor. And Capacitor, well, is now the engine we kind of use to build our native applications. And following along a bit the Ionic history, at some point Ionic decided, well, AngularJS is probably not the best thing. So they also adopted bindings for general Angular 2 plus. Now we're at Angular 15. But they also made it.
It's hard to keep up.
I think 15 is like. And they also made a transition under the hood that every Ionic component, let's say an Ion card that renders a card, or an Ion toolbar that renders a toolbar, under the hood, all of these things are now web components. And if you know, web component is a standard that you could use everywhere. So that was a big change of Ionic. And this change enabled them to later also come out with specific bindings for React or for Vue, or you could use it with vanilla JavaScript. And the only problem is that this kind of happened like 2 years late, maybe 3 years late. And at that point, everyone was already into React Native. Like all the React developers decided, okay, our thing is React Native. And so Ionic is still heavily, like most of Ionic developers that you will meet are some kind of Angular developers. I'm now creating React content, and there are a lot of people getting started with Ionic React or even Ionic Vue, but I think it's still like 70% Angular and then like 20% React. So there's just a historic thing. Because people assume Ionic is Angular, but actually, in fact, you could use it with whatever you want. So that brings us to Capacitor and to today. And the thing is that Ionic and Capacitor are actually not really related. Like everyone thinks of this. Capacitor is a thing from Ionic, yeah, and Ionic is whatever. But you can just have a standard Next.js application or a standard React application for web and add Capacitor, and then build a native mobile app. And that's what people don't really know yet. And Capacitor did a poor job. I think Max Lynch, the CEO of Ionic, is currently working exactly in that direction, because the awareness of Capacitor is not very high among React developers. And yeah, I don't know if we're going to get there in the next years, because most developers, most React developers that try out Capacitor actually end up really liking it. Because the thing is, as I said, if you're using React Native, you have to learn some React Native specific things. But if you just throw in Capacitor in your Next.js application and you get a mobile application without changes, like that's the dream. That's like the end goal of having one code base to cover all platforms. When you said in the beginning, I want to have a website, I want to have a mobile app, like this would be the solution. But in terms of UI and like small details, we're probably not yet there.
Interesting. I'm kind of curious what the exporting and publishing process looks like with this. Maybe without. Well, I'm curious where those details come, because one of the things that people, if you've never done mobile development, don't know, is like actually publishing to the store is an effort in and of itself. I think even more so with iOS than Android. But you have to export and you get like an individual file on Android. It used to be an APK was the name of the
Mhm.
file, the package. I don't know what it is on iOS. But you export that thing and then you include all this metadata in your app about what your app is, then you submit it to the store and it gets approved or not, and then you have to go back and figure out why. What's the like export out of Ionic, and then if you're just using Capacitor, is exporting to get to the store, is that also supported in Capacitor, or is
No,
that different based on if you use Ionic?
no, that's not different. It's the
Okay.
same with capacitors. So the idea is really you generate the native iOS or Android project with capacitor, and capacitor puts the web view into like the main UI whatever control and
Mhm.
renders your app in there. But that's where capacitor pretty much ends.
Okay.
And at that point, you are left to the native tooling because capacitor said, well, there are the native tools like with Xcode, for example, you can just click a button and archive and then upload. And with Android, you can it's called today a bundle, so it's a
Mm.
AAB something file, I think AAB,
Yeah.
but APK was before that,
Yep.
yeah. And Capacitor just lets you do this with the native tools because the native tools exist and they are great. But
Okay.
yeah, if you're a web developer, this is definitely one thing you need to learn. And it kind of, I kind of don't exactly get why people think it's hard. Like, okay, I get that you from the out. If you've never done it, you feel like, oh, this is so hard.
Mhm.
But I went through the process for like writing a tutorial, and to me kind of the steps are pretty obvious. Like you go to the native, you say like export in Android Studio and it guides you through a wizard, like okay, create a signing key, put in this, put in that, okay, now you can upload this. Yeah, configuring the stuff in the Google Play console is like a different game. Like, I think there are 13 steps or so you need to, like the
Mhm.
content rating and what APIs you use, and
Yep.
like if you do any criminal thing, the
Obviously.
icons, you need app screenshots. This is definitely painful, but usually it's like just a process.
Yep. And I
Um,
imagine after that's the sort of thing that after you do that a handful of times, then it's just second nature. But even something small like you mentioned the signing key, and I remember that being a thing, but I have no idea what the signing key is or what it's for, right? It's different things that we don't necessarily think about.
can also
Um,
be a problem if you lose your signing key and you can't upgrade your Android applications because you lost the password for the signing key.
well, that
That
sounds terrible
can be
too.
a nightmare
Yeah.
as well.
So the export process built in a capacitor is the ability to take your web project and then capacitor gives you an export command to an Android project or to an iOS project. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Capacitor CLI also adds like a few other cool things. For example, you can run like Capacitor run iOS external. So it can also spin up a local development server of your React or Angular application. And then on the app, set like a remote URL. So you get live reload on a device during debugging, which is, I mean, it's pretty standard these days. React Native has it as well. Flutter does have it as well. So it's just one thing, but that's what you get from the Capacitor CLI.
Okay.
And
Yeah. Does Ionic add anything on top of that for publishing or for exporting, or it just uses the stuff from capacitor for that?
no, Ionic is really not adding anything. Like
Okay.
Ionic, they are also in the process of rebranding this a bit because it's confusing. I think we should say Ionic framework, and that is pretty much just like a mobile UI toolkit, like a
Okay.
navigation bar, an alert dialog, a modal. And the cool thing about Ionic, so this is like coming from my history now, is that Ionic is they're giving you great controls out of the box. Like I said, a tab bar or a side menu you can implement. And it also, these are adaptive controls. So if you deploy your application to iOS, they will look like iOS specific controls. And if you deploy it to Android, they will look like Android controls because like they pretty much the technology is they see what's what browser you're running in, and then they add like the material design or iOS class to the body of the HTML, and
Okay. So
then
it
they have different styling classes for their own components.
yeah.
That's
So it
like
does
the whole
that
magic.
intelligently, the
Yeah,
UI
exactly.
kit that they give you. Okay, very cool. Yeah, that's good to know because I didn't fully I'm figuring out the difference as we're talking, like solidifying what is capacitor. And someone mentioned capacitor in the chat at the beginning of this conversation, and I was like, "What is capacitor?" Having no idea that it was like part of Ionic. And then later they mentioned, I think they said web plus capacitor plus custom code equals Ionic. So meaning you write like web stuff that you're used to. You have capacitor for like their cross-platform APIs and the export, and then any additional custom code you want to add on top of that is Ionic.
Yeah. It's so interesting how like the definition of Ionic is so problematic. I'm really not an advocate for their stuffs, but this just shows that they definitely need to put some
Yeah.
time into the branding. Like
Mhm.
probably they should just be the mobile UI company, and I don't
Yeah.
know, call Ionic Mobile Kit or something. It's
Call it
just
mobile kit
really
company.
really. So yeah, probably the problem is it's the Ionic company. The Ionic company is the creator of the Ionic framework, of
Mhm.
Capacitor, and on that note, also of Stencil. So if you've heard of Stencil.js,
Yeah.
that's actually a creator for web components similar to like lit elements.
Mhm.
Stencil is also from the Ionic company.
And you mentioned Ionic UI kit uses web components. I assume it uses Stencil behind like a is that
Yeah,
tied to? Yeah.
now you're
Okay.
getting they're
Yeah.
dog fooding their own stuff. So yeah,
Yeah.
they build Stencil so they can build their own web components.
That makes sense. It's also cool for it to be a first class citizen, I guess, in Ionic, but also then be something that people can use on its own. Because you said capacitor people can use in any kind of project, but then also, in this case, stencil is its own thing as well that people could use completely aside from
Yeah.
Ionic. Yeah,
Exactly.
cool.
Yeah. And
Um,
you can also throw in Ionic components in every in every project. Like if you have a standard React web application, you could still import Ionic components if you wanted to. Like
because they're just web components
the
and it
web
will work.
components.
Yeah. Okay.
You don't get all the benefits of using Ionic because if you use them, like they have a specific router on top of the React router, so they can have page transitions like a push
Mm,
animation or
yeah.
whatever. You probably don't get this if you just like import an alert or just a card from Ionic. But yeah, there are definitely different ways to use the Ionic UI. But really, Ionic framework is only UI components
part.
and
Yeah.
modals and gestures, and you have to use like something like Cordova or Capacitor to actually build your
To do
native
the
app.
cross platform. Yeah. Very cool.
Or you keep it at web. Like you could also
Yeah.
deploy it as a website, of course.
Fair enough. Yeah. Christian commented on YouTube saying that he tried Ionic and Capacitor a few years ago. Unfortunately, didn't like it. Been working with Angular, and I'm sorry to say, but I hate Angular. But this is going back to your point earlier, like not directly associated with Angular. You can use this in React and Vue. Are there any other frameworks that you can use Ionic with? Like,
There is a community effort to make this work with Svelte.
okay,
But I think
that
it's
would
not
be
yet
my next
finished, and
guess.
I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't know if they officially support this. Like, it's a problem for them in general. I don't know how they want to do this. They have these specific bindings. Let's call it bindings for React and Vue and Angular, and you can imagine like some major update to React, and they're gonna have to change all
Do a
the
lot of yeah.
bindings, and then for Angular the same. It's gonna be a hell of an update
Mhm.
in the future. So I don't know. But you can also again use them with vanilla JavaScript. But I think that the main thing here is that Ionic makes they make a lot of assumptions about the UI. They pretty much say, okay, you want to use native controls, native Android and iOS stuff. Like here we go. With
Okay.
React Native, you pretty much draw CSS and HTML on the screen, and like everything
do
in
it
the React
yourself.
ecosystem, like
Yeah.
do it yourself, pick whatever library you want. And so Ionic is very opinionated about the UI, whereas React Native is not. Flutter is also kind of opinionated. Flutter is by default material design, so every application,
Figures.
and it is, by the way, a lot harder to do this with an iOS style. If you want to have a Flutter application that looks on iOS like iOS and on Android like Android, you're gonna get into trouble because that's really not where Flutter shines. You're gonna have a lot of if statements, and with
Yeah.
Ionic, you get this out of the box.
Out of the box, yeah. And that, I mean, Flutter is from Google, so staying like supporting the Google ecosystem is not a
Do
huge
you know?
surprise.
Do you know what the other theme for iOS applications is called in Flutter?
No, I'm curious.
It's the Cupertino theme.
Oh, nice. I could see that. I like it. Did they weren't they working on like a brand new massive building, Apple, that looked like a spaceship somewhere? I don't know if you remember. I feel like this was years ago.
I think they have it, don't
Is
they?
it finished? I don't I imagine. I don't actually know. Who knows?
Did your watch just tell you to stand? Because we both looked at our Apple Watch.
Yes.
And my
Yeah,
watch told me
actually,
to stand.
that's exactly what mine just said. So that's weird. Does it do it on the same exact minute every day? Which is
I
also
don't
weird
know.
because I'm standing already. So I don't know. Watch is not super observant. I love it though. What are there any exciting like things in the future that you're excited about? Maybe it's features in Ionic, maybe it's other tools that you've heard of. Anything that you're excited to try out maybe for the first time this year or to see how it gets adopted this year?
In terms of Ionic, they're working on version 7 right now, so Ionic 7. And I recently looked at the preview, which like they're just adding cool UI things at this point. Like it's not revolutionary things; they just make the developer experience better, I guess. One thing that was pretty cool, but I'm not sure if they're gonna follow through, was like they wanted to give you the option to completely shut off the Ionic styling, so you can then add your own styling, because styling Ionic and is like styling web components is a bit more challenging than just writing CSS. So web components usually have a scoped CSS, so it's pretty hard from the outside to actually inject the styling into web components. So you have to use a lot of CSS variables with Ionic to actually inject styling, and that makes things challenging. They're making that a bit bigger. I don't know if this is going to be big. Otherwise, so Ionic got last year acquired by OutSystems, so the Ionic company. And OutSystems is, I think, like a low code, no code company, quite big. So I don't know what's coming out of that. I feel like maybe something cool like a low code, no code builder that is then exporting some Ionic code. That would be like
That would be cool.
interesting.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, Ionic is also not the main focus, I think, of the company. It's more Capacitor, because Capacitor is really Capacitor is what's going against React Native and Flutter. So that's their building tool, and they want to get people like the React community to use Capacitor to build native applications. And they definitely need to step up the game a bit in terms of the branding, and probably also in terms of the ecosystem, like the plugins. There are not a ton of plugins for Capacitor. There are certainly more Cordova plugins. And I'm in general, I'm following. I don't think there will be anything big. Like they do every now and then come out with a cool project. Sometimes it's a paid project because they're still a company and need to make money. So, for example, they have their own CI/CD solution called AppFlow, which can handle also all the things that Expo does, for example. That's quite interesting. Like you can connect it to your repository, and then it can build in the cloud, and it can even upload to the app stores. And that's exactly what the Expo EAS, I think that's it called, does this as well. Like that's handling the ugly part that we talked about before, like building in the cloud, handling your keys, uploading to Google.
Okay.
That's also what the Ionic company is doing. Or like a project called Portals, so you can in any application embed like a portal, and in that portal display like your own little web micro front end. They're doing some quite interesting things. But at the same time, React Native is also progressing. Flutter just had a major release or announced like the next Dart version. So everything in the ecosystem is definitely moving forward. And I don't know if there will be a winner. People always like to ask like, oh, React Native is the best and Flutter is the best. And I always say there's definitely no best. You should always evaluate what your project is about, what your scope is, what your developers know about, what the client expects in the end. There's so many variables when you create a project that you just can't say upfront, yeah, always use React Native or always use Capacitor. It's just not possible.
Yep. Yeah, I feel like I've been in that situation where people try to tell you without knowing any details of what you're doing. You should always use blah blah blah, and I'm always very skeptical of those people because there's always it depends. Nikki T in the chat on YouTube
Yeah.
is saying that, and it's true. Like it's one of the most cliche things that developers say, but it also we say that because it actually does. Like the difference in differences in frameworks and tools and platforms, they make a difference depending on what you're doing. But I think we've proven that the ecosystem is big enough for lots of different tools to be successful because we joke about like how overwhelming the JavaScript ecosystem is. For example, like there's so many different things, but they're still successful, and that's just because the ecosystem is big enough to support it.
Yeah, and on that note, we haven't even talked about stuff like Electron. So you can also with Capacitor add Electron to the mix, and then you have a desktop application.
Oh, true. Yeah.
Or at that point, which brings me back to one comment we got on YouTube in the beginning. Tori is completely dominating. By the way, this part of the State of JS survey. I still have it open, so I'm just looking at it. In the last year and this year, Tori interest is at 92%. So Tori is, I think, built with Rust, and Rust is also getting a lot of hype lately.
Yep.
I think it's also used mostly like an Electron replacement, so it works a bit better than Electron. And as far as I know, Tori is currently working on something to also build mobile apps, but at that point, I kind of like, I don't know. We already got Capacitor. Can Tori do it better? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know here. Also, then we also got native script, another interesting thing, but that's then going. Yeah, you see the ecosystem
I shake my head. Yeah,
unbelievable
yeah.
big of different tools for cross-platform, but the biggest are definitely React Native with Expo, Flutter. For me, Capacitor, and probably in the future Tori. So that's on my list, very high up to check out.
Very cool. Love it. This has been super helpful for me. Again, I love episodes where I get to come in and not know a whole lot about where we are and be able to ask the questions and learn along the way. But I think we can move into our last section of the podcast, which is our picks and plugs section. I'll go first, so I take a little bit of pressure off of you. So my pick is a TV show called Lockwood and Co. on Netflix. I haven't picked a TV show in a long time, I don't think, but it's kind of a almost mystical. It's basically like kind of a team of ghost hunters that go out and solve cases for ghosts. And anyway, there's like it's a little bit of a younger audience, probably, like I would think kind of a teenager type audience, but it's been interesting enough to just like watch and kind of have fun with and not have to be super serious and pay a ton of attention to. So that's Lockwood and Co. series on Netflix. And then for my plug, I'm going to plug my TikTok channel. So I've been doing TikTok for like a year and a half, kind of off and on, and trying to take it more seriously. I've decided I want to do more skits. So like kind of developer satire humor things where I play one person and maybe play a second person, or just like have the audio for a second person and just poke fun at like developers and web development and kind of where we are in that. So
I
enjoy doing that kind of stuff.
Great.
Yeah, they're fun. So I'm James Q Quick on TikTok.
I don't know why, but I sometimes get push notifications from TikTok, and when I do get a push notification, it always says James Q Quick posted a new reel or whatever on TikTok. I don't get this for anyone else, just for you.
I've hacked your phone to make sure I get maximum visibility.
I don't know what it is, but yeah.
Yeah. There's something that I get for one person also. When I scroll, I see something about posting a story, but I always see the same person's name on it, and it's someone that I don't know at all or interact with. It's really interesting. So I don't know, but I'm glad to know that I show up on your phone. That's a win for me. So
okay, so my pick is something I actually haven't seen, but I think is pretty great. It just came out the other day. So when the podcast goes live, it's been a few weeks probably, but that's the React documentary. I don't know why people make a documentary about React, but I feel like this is going to be interesting. I've seen a few memes around it already, and I think it's anyway worthwhile to like get a better understanding about React and the background of React. As far as I know, there have been some developers involved, and they talk about why Facebook did it back then. Yeah, check out the React documentary. Should be on YouTube. It should be quite interesting. For the plug, can I only plug one or two things?
Plug away.
I'm definitely going to plug galaxies.dev, which is my new platform. So on galaxies.dev, I'm going to create courses with me as a course instructor, with other people as course instructors. You can sign up for free. When this episode goes live, Galaxies should be launched, hopefully. Otherwise, you can get on the waiting list. But I'm pretty sure when you listen to it later, check out galaxies.dev and you can create a free account. And also, you can check out, if you're into podcasts, the All the Code podcast, which I do with Simon. So that is our own coding podcast. We would like to have you listen to us as well. So, of course, always first listen to Compressed FM. That's the priority here today. And if you've listened to all the episodes, you should also listen to the All the Code podcast. You can find us also in, I think, pretty much every podcasting application. YouTube, Spotify, everywhere. Go check it out.
Love it. That's awesome. And this is Simon Barker is who you're working with?
Yeah. We're two Simons. That's kind of
Nice.
complicated.
That's great. I love it. Cool. Let me throw a link to that in the chat. I've got it noted. So we'll include links to that in the show notes for everybody that's listening to the podcast. And if you are listening to the podcast version of this, please leave a rating and review to help other people find the podcast so we can continue to do more of this stuff and have on more amazing guests like Simon, because it's like one of the highlights of my week, I think, just from a networking perspective, from a meeting people's perspective, and then for me from a learning perspective, because people come on and teach us about topics like cross-platform that I didn't know a whole lot about.
Happy to be here. I'm happy I could share some insights about the state of cross-platform. So let's have this again next year in January, and then we talk about the state of cross-platform in 2024.
I love it. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to go and call it. Thank you, everyone, for hanging out. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time.
Bye.